For the first 18 years of my life, the concept of home was not just a physical location. It was a living, breathing entity inextricably tied to a sprawling, two-story craftsman house sitting quietly at the end of a wooded cul-de-sac. My father, Richard, bought that house when I was just a toddler, back when it was nothing but a dilapidated, rotting shell that everyone else in the neighborhood considered an absolute eyesore. But my father was a master carpenter, a man whose large, calloused hands could coax life and beauty out of dead, splintered wood. Over the course of a decade, he poured his entire soul, his sweat and his meager savings into rebuilding that property from the foundation up. Every single wide plank oak floorboard was painstakingly laid and stained by him. Every piece of intricate crown molding was measured, cut, and sanded by his hands. Growing up, the house constantly smelled of fresh pine shavings, warm beeswax polish, and the strong dark roast coffee he brewed at 5 in the morning. It was our absolute sanctuary, a fortress of love and safety, especially after my mother tragically passed away from an aggressive breast cancer when I was just 7 years old. For a very long time after her death, it was just the two of us against the harshness of the world, quietly navigating our profound grief within those sturdy, warm, familiar walls. Then, when I was 15 years old, the sanctuary was breached. Evelyn entered the picture. Evelyn was the kind of woman who treated her entire life and everyone in it like a calculated business acquisition. She was incredibly polished, always draped in expensive designer labels she couldn't actually afford, with a perfect, practiced smile that never, ever reached her cold, calculating, predatory eyes. She met my father at a local hardware and contracting convention, and she immediately recognized him for exactly what he was. A kind, generous, deeply lonely, and grieving man who happened to own a fully paid-off, incredibly valuable piece of prime real estate. She played the part of the loving, supportive, perfect partner flawlessly for the first year. She cooked his favorite heavy meals. She laughed loudly at his terrible dad jokes, and she pretended to care deeply about my schooling and my hobbies. But the absolute second the wedding ring slipped onto her finger, and the marriage certificate was signed, the carefully constructed mask began to slip, revealing the monster underneath. The warm, sawdust-scented home my father had lovingly built slowly, agonizingly transformed into a sterile, unwelcoming showroom. She threw away his handmade, comfortable furniture and replaced it with cold, modern glass and sharp metal edges. She systematically alienated his lifelong blue-collar friends because they weren't sophisticated or wealthy enough to fit the high society image she was desperately trying to cultivate. And she made it abundantly, painfully clear to me, through 1,000 tiny, deniable microaggressions, that I was nothing more than an unwanted, lingering ghost from a past she wanted to erase. She would accidentally throw away my school projects, complain about the cost of my groceries, and constantly suggest boarding schools out of state. My father, completely blinded by his desperate, agonizing desire for companionship and terrified of growing old alone in a quiet house, willfully ignored the glaring red flags. He would pull me aside in the garage out of earshot of his new wife, press a wrinkled $20 bill into my hand and whisper, "Just give her time, Leo. She means well, she just has a different way of doing things. We just have to adjust. Please, just try to get along." I loved him far too much to shatter his fragile, manufactured happiness, so I retreated. I shrank myself to make room for her ego. I spent all my time in the unfinished basement or at the local public library, burying myself in my studies, silently counting down the agonizing days until I could graduate high school and move out on my own terms. But I never got the chance to leave on my own terms. The universe had a much crueler plan. During the autumn of my senior year of high school, my father began losing weight rapidly. His skin turned a sickly shade of yellow, and the man who used to carry massive oak beams on his shoulder could barely walk up the stairs. He was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was aggressive, merciless, and terrifyingly fast. Within 4 short months, the strong, capable, vibrant man who had built our entire home with his bare hands was reduced to a fragile, bedridden shadow of himself, hooked up to a morphine drip in a sterile hospice room. Evelyn's reaction to his terminal illness was incredibly telling, and it was the final confirmation of everything I had always known about her. She didn't grieve. She didn't cry. She panicked. But she wasn't worried about losing her husband. She was terrified of losing her lifestyle. While I spent every single waking moment sitting by his hospice bed, holding his thinning, bruised hand, feeding him ice chips, and reading him his favorite Louis L'Amour Western novels. Evelyn spent her time aggressively meeting with estate lawyers, financial planners, and life insurance agents. She would visit the hospital for 10 minutes a day, complain about the parking, check her designer watch, and leave to go have lunch with her friends. My father passed away on a freezing, rainy Tuesday morning in late October. I was holding his hand when he took his last rattling breath. The heart monitor flatlined, emitting a continuous, piercing tone. The nurses rushed in, quietly turned off the machine, offered their soft condolences, and left me alone in the room. My entire universe completely collapsed. I was barely 18 years old, entirely alone in the world, and utterly, irreparably shattered. I stayed in his hospital room for 3 hours, crying until I physically couldn't breathe, unable to let go of his cold hand. When I finally forced myself to leave the hospital and walked back into our house late that afternoon, I was physically exhausted, soaked from the rain, and emotionally hollowed out. I just wanted to go to my bedroom, crawl into my bed, and sleep for a week. Instead, I opened the front door and found Aunt Evelyn standing in the center of the foyer. She was dressed in an immaculate, incredibly expensive black morning dress, her hair perfectly styled. At her feet were 2 large, heavy-duty black trash bags. "I'm changing all the locks tomorrow morning," she said. Her voice was completely flat, monotone, and entirely devoid of a single ounce of empathy, grief, or basic human decency. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer a single word of comfort to a grieving boy who had just watched his only parent die. She just nudged the trash bags toward my feet, with the toe of her expensive pump. "Your father left the house entirely to me in survivorship," she continued, looking at me with a cold, triumphant smirk. "His life insurance goes entirely to me. His savings go to me. I've already spoken to the attorney, and the paperwork is ironclad. You turned 18 2 months ago. You are legally an adult. You have until midnight tonight to pack whatever else you need and leave my property." I stared at her, my rain-soaked clothes dripping onto the oak floor my father had laid, my brain completely unable to process the sheer, psychopathic cruelty of what she was saying. My father's body wasn't even cold yet. He was still lying in a hospital bed waiting for the morgue transport. The smell of hospital antiseptic was still clinging to my jacket. "Evelyn, what are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice cracking, my knees trembling so hard I thought I was going to collapse. "This is my home. This is my dad's house. You can't do this." "It was your dad's house," she corrected sharply, her eyes narrowing with a cold, victorious, venomous gleam. "Now it is my house, and I do not want you in it. I have tolerated your miserable, moping presence for 3 agonizing years solely for Richard's sake. But Richard is gone now. The charade is over. I want you out. If you aren't completely off my property by midnight, I will call the police, tell them you are threatening me, and have you physically removed and arrested for trespassing. Do not test me, Leo. I was too broken, too utterly destroyed by the horrific trauma of losing my father to fight her. I didn't have the money for a lawyer. I didn't understand property laws or survivorship deeds. I didn't know my rights as a tenant. I was just a terrified, grieving, exhausted teenager. I numbly picked up the trash bag she had provided, walked up the stairs like a zombie to the bedroom I had slept in since I was a baby, and packed whatever clothes, toiletries, and sentimental items I could fit. I packed my mother's old vinyl records, my father's favorite worn-out leather hammer belt, a few framed photographs, and my high school textbooks. At exactly 11 p.m. on the darkest day of my entire life, I walked down the stairs and out the front door. Evelyn stood on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching me load my garbage bags into the trunk of my beat-up, 15-year-old Honda Civic. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't offer me $1 for food. As I backed out of the driveway, the heavy brass deadbolt clicked loudly behind me. locking me out of my entire childhood and throwing me into the abyss. The next 5 years of my life were a grueling, brutal, agonizing exercise in pure, unfiltered survival. I didn't have a safety net. I didn't have aunts or uncles to fall back on. For the first 6 months, I lived entirely in my freezing car. I parked in the dark, hidden corners of 24-hour retail parking lots, shivering violently through the bitter, unforgiving winter nights under a pile of cheap thrift store blankets. I cried myself to sleep almost every single night as the profound, suffocating grief of losing my father threatened to swallow me alive. I showered at a cheap, grungy local gym using trial passes. I ate dry ramen noodles and jars of cheap peanut butter to survive. But in the absolute lowest, darkest, most freezing moments of living at that car, staring up at the frosted windshield, something fundamental inside my brain shifted. The crushing, paralyzing grief slowly hardened. It crystallized into a cold, diamond-sharp, unbreakable, relentless ambition. Evelyn had taken my home, she had stolen my inheritance, and she had ripped away my security. But I absolutely refused to let that parasite take my future. I decided right then and there that I was going to become so successful, so wealthy, and so powerful that no one would ever be able to dictate my life or throw me out into the cold ever again. I got a grueling job working the graveyard shift at an all-night diner, scrubbing greasy dishes and mopping floors until my hands bled. During the day, running on 2 hours of sleep, I bussed tables at a high-end, expensive steakhouse downtown, specifically so I could listen to the wealthy businessmen talk about investments, real estate, and market trends. I saved every single penny I made. I didn't go out with friends. I didn't buy new clothes. I lived like an absolute ghost, driven by pure, unadulterated spite and the memory of my father. Eventually, I saved enough cash to rent a tiny roach-infested studio apartment in a bad part of town. I started taking community college classes in finance, business management, and real estate law, paying entirely out of pocket and studying until my eyes burned. By the time I was 21, I had passed my exams, earned my real estate license, and started working as a junior agent for a cutthroat commercial brokerage firm. I was completely relentless. I worked 80 to 90-hour weeks, out-hustling, out-learning, and out-working people twice my age. I took the lowest-paying, hardest deals no one else wanted and turned them into gold. I used my pain and my anger as rocket fuel. I learned how the market worked. I learned how to leverage debt, how to identify distressed properties, and how to flip small residential homes, reinvesting every single ounce of profit into the next, bigger deal. By my 23rd birthday, I had broken away from the brokerage and established my own highly successful, rapidly growing property management and private equity investment firm. I named it Phoenix Holdings. I was wealthy, I was incredibly secure, and I was entirely fiercely self-made. But despite the tailored suits and the luxury cars, I never, ever forgot the devastating sound of that deadbolt clicking on the night my father died. While I was quietly, methodically building my empire in the shadows, Evelyn was loudly, spectacularly, and predictably destroying hers. Through mutual acquaintances in the city and her desperate need to flaunt her life on social media, I occasionally heard rumors about her status. Without my father's steady, sensible, hard-working hand to manage the household finances, Evelyn had treated his life insurance payout, his retirement accounts, and his hard-earned savings like an infinite, bottomless lottery winning. She immediately bought a brand-new, top-of-the-line luxury SUV she couldn't afford to maintain. She took lavish, month-long vacations to Paris and Milan, staying in 5-star hotels to maintain her fake, high-society image on Instagram. She threw thousands of dollars at terrible, high-risk investments in her shallow friends' failing boutique businesses, desperately wanting to be seen as a wealthy, influential benefactor in her social circle. But fake wealth is a fragile house of cards, and financial gravity always, eventually, wins. When the life insurance money inevitably dried up and the savings accounts hit zero, she started taking out aggressive, high-interest home equity loans against my father's fully paid-off Craftsman house to fund her rampant shopping addictions and her mounting credit card debt. She fundamentally misunderstood that the house was a finite resource, not an ATM. By year 4, the rumors I heard changed drastically. They went from whispers about her lavish European vacations to gossip about her declined credit cards, her missed car payments, and her desperate attempts to borrow money from the friends she had previously bought. By year 5, the absolute inevitable finally happened. The bank lost their patience and called in the massive defaulted loans. Evelyn, entirely out of money, out of credit, and completely out of wealthy friends to sponge off of, went into severe, unrecoverable default. I found out about the impending foreclosure through a standard automated MLS real estate listing alert I had set up 5 years ago for my exact childhood address. When the email popped into my inbox on a Tuesday morning, a pre-foreclosure public auction notice for the Craftsman house, my heart physically stopped beating for a moment. I sat at my massive, polished oak desk in my corner office, overlooking the city skyline, staring at the glowing computer screen for an hour. I clicked through the preliminary listing photos, and they absolutely broke my heart. The house looked exhausted, defeated, and deeply sad. The beautiful front lawn my father used to mow every Saturday was completely dead, brown, and overgrown with weeds. The exterior paint was peeling in large strips, the gutters were sagging, and the beautiful wide front porch my father had lovingly built by hand was cluttered with cheap, rusting patio furniture and bags of uncollected garbage. She had sucked the absolute life and soul out of the property, just like she had tried to suck the life out of my father, and just like she had tried to destroy me. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a single, fleeting shred of pity or sympathy for her situation. I felt the cold, methodical, absolute precision of a patient hunter who had sat in the freezing woods for 5 long years, finally lining up the perfect, fatal shot. I immediately contacted my primary corporate attorney and instructed him to utilize the blind, anonymous LLC Phoenix Holdings to handle the transaction. I didn't want my name appearing anywhere on the initial public paperwork. I wanted total, terrifying anonymity until the very last second. When the house finally went to the county courthouse steps for the public foreclosure auction a month later, I didn't attend. My proxy bidder was there in my place. There were a few other local investors looking for a quick, cheap flip, but I had explicitly authorized my proxy to aggressively outbid everyone, no matter how high the price went. I didn't care about the profit margin. I didn't care about the return on investment. I was buying back my history. I was buying back my soul. The hammer fell. The transaction cleared the bank. I owned the house outright, in cash. Because it was a bank foreclosure, the eviction process for the current illegal occupant, Evelyn, was standard, highly legal, and entirely absolute. The county sheriff officially served her with a mandatory 30-day notice to vacate the premises. Through my attorney, I received weekly updates on her frantic behavior. Evelyn apparently fought the eviction tooth and nail like a cornered rat. She called the bank crying. She screamed at the court clerks. She hired a cheap lawyer she couldn't afford to file frivolous delays. And she claimed to the judge that she was a helpless victim of predatory lending. But the law doesn't care about the manufactured tears of an arrogant woman who spent all her equity on designer handbags and Italian vacations. When the 30 days officially expired and she still stubbornly hadn't left the property, the final mandatory eviction lockout was scheduled by the sheriff's department for a crisp, cool Thursday morning at exactly 9 a.m. I cleared my entire corporate schedule for that day. I drove up to the familiar cul-de-sac at exactly 8:45 a.m. I wasn't driving my beat-up, freezing old Honda Civic anymore. I pulled up to the curb in a sleek, custom-ordered, pitch-black Range Rover. I parked directly behind the county sheriff's cruiser and a large, contracted commercial moving truck that the county had provided to forcibly remove whatever belongings she hadn't packed and dump them on the public curb. I sat in the quiet, climate-controlled cabin of my car for a long moment, gripping the leather steering wheel, just looking at the house. The memories hit me like a physical, suffocating wave. My father laughing on the porch holding a glass of iced tea, the smell of fresh sawdust drifting from the garage, the devastating, rainy night I was thrown out into the cold with nothing but a trash bag. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, smoothed the lapels of my impeccably tailored, $3,000 navy blue suit, checked my luxury watch, and stepped out of the car. Evelyn was standing on the dead, overgrown grass of the front lawn. She looked entirely, shockingly different from the polished, arrogant, terrifying woman who had kicked me out 5 years ago. She looked haggard, deeply desperate, and incredibly aged. Her dyed hair was unkempt, showing thick gray roots. She was wearing stained sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, and she was frantically screaming and gesturing wildly at the two impassive, stone-faced sheriff's deputies who were standing on the porch, holding clipboards and waiting for the locksmith. "You can't do this to me," she was screeching, her voice shrill, raspy, and panicked. "This is my home. My husband built this house. I have lived here for 8 years. You need to give me more time. The bank made a mistake with my paperwork. Let me speak to the new owners. Let me speak to the investors. Just give me a phone number. I can work out a payment plan with them. I just need a few more weeks." "Ma'am," the lead deputy said calmly, completely and utterly unfazed by her pathetic hysterics, having seen this 100 times before. "The property was legally sold at a public auction over a month ago. You were given the standard 30 days legal notice by the court. You failed to vacate. The new owner is legally taking physical possession of the property today at 9 a.m. You need to step aside right now so the locksmith can change the locks, or you will be arrested for interfering with a court order." I walked slowly up the cracked concrete driveway, my expensive leather shoes clicking softly and rhythmically against the pavement. Evelyn didn't notice me approaching at first. She was too busy sobbing into her hands and begging the deputies. "Excuse me, officers," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and carried a quiet, undeniable authority that cut right through her hysterical sobbing. "I am the executive representative for Phoenix Holdings. I have the updated recorded deed, my identification, and the final court possession order right here for your review." Evelyn whipped her head around at the sound of my voice. Her tear-streaked, blotchy face froze in an expression of absolute, comical, paralyzing shock. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, rapidly scanning my expensive suit, my luxury car parked at the curb, the confident way I held myself, and finally settling on my face. It took her frantic, panicked brain a few agonizing, silent seconds to reconcile the terrified, broke, weeping teenager she had thrown out onto the street with the confident, wealthy, powerful businessman standing right in front of her. "Leo," she whispered, all the air rushing out of her lungs as if she had been punched in the stomach. She took a stumbling, clumsy step backward, her shaking hands flying up to cover her open mouth. "Leo, what are you doing here? How are you here?" I didn't smile, I didn't laugh, I didn't gloat or raise my voice. I simply looked at her with the exact same cold, flat, entirely humanity's expression she had given me in the foyer on the day my father died. "Hello, Evelyn," I said smoothly, turning my attention away from her and handing my thick folder of legal paperwork to the deputy. The officer reviewed the documents carefully, checked my ID, and nodded respectfully. "I'm here to take possession of my property." Her brain completely short-circuited. She shook her head wildly. "Your property? No, that's impossible. The bank sold it to a massive investment firm. Phoenix Holdings bought it at the auction. You can't be here. You don't have that kind of money." "I'm the founder and CEO of Phoenix Holdings, Evelyn," I replied, folding my hands casually in front of me, watching the reality crush her. "I bought the house at the courthouse auction a month ago. I paid in full, in cash. It is my house now." The remaining color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. She swayed on her feet, looking like she was going to be physically sick right there on the driveway. The sheer, terrifying, inescapable realization of what was actually happening crashed over her like a tidal wave. She suddenly realized that the anonymous, faceless corporate entity that had ruthlessly ignored her frantic letters, pleading for extensions, the entity that had aggressively pushed the eviction through the courts without an ounce of mercy, was the very kid she had thrown out like garbage 5 years ago. "Leo, please," she stammered, her former arrogance instantly evaporating into pathetic, sickening, groveling desperation. She took a step toward me, reaching out with a trembling hand. "Please, Leo, you have to help me. I don't have anywhere else to go. My credit is completely ruined. I have no money. My friends won't answer my calls anymore. I don't even have money for a cheap motel room tonight. You can't just throw me out on the street like this. Richard would never want this. Your father would be absolutely horrified to see you treating his widow this way." Hearing her explicitly weaponize my father's name, trying to use the memory of the man she had used and discarded to save her own skin, was the only thing that made my pulse spike. But I kept my face perfectly, dangerously still. I took one deliberate step closer to her, invading her space just enough to let her feel the absolute, crushing power dynamic shift. I looked down at her. "Do not ever, ever speak my father's name again," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal, ice-cold whisper that only she could hear over the sound of the idling moving truck. My father was a good, generous, hard-working man who was completely blinded by a parasitic leech. You bled his finances dry. You isolated him. And the very day his heart stopped beating in that hospital, you threw his only grieving child out into the freezing cold night with a plastic trash bag. You told me I had until midnight. You told me you would call the cops and have me thrown in jail if I didn't leave. Evelyn was violently shaking now, ugly tears streaming down her face, ruining her mascara. I was grieving. I was in shock. I wasn't thinking straight. "I'm so sorry, Leo. I made a terrible mistake. Please, just give me a month. Just let me stay in the guest room until I figure something out. I'll stay out of your way. Please, you have to have some mercy on me." I looked at her, truly looking at the pathetic, broken, hollow shell of a woman who had tried so casually to destroy my life without a second thought. "Mercy," I echoed softly, letting the word hang in the crisp morning air. "Evelyn, I am showing you exactly the same amount of mercy you showed me 5 years ago. Actually, if we're being technical, I'm showing you significantly more. I gave you 30 days legal, written notice through the courts. You gave me less than 12 hours. I turned away from her, breaking eye contact permanently, dismissing her entirely from my reality. She no longer mattered. I looked at the deputies on the porch. "Offices, is the property legally cleared? Can the locksmith proceed with the hardware changes?" "Yes, sir. You are good to go," the lead deputy replied, gesturing to the locksmith who was already walking up the path with his drill. The deputy turned to Evelyn. "Ma'am, you need to step off the private property line and onto the public sidewalk right now. The movers are going to start boxing up whatever garbage is left inside and placing it on the curb. If you do not step off the grass, I will place you in handcuffs." Evelyn broke down into hysterical, ugly, gasping sobs, sinking to her knees on the dying brown grass, burying her face in her hands. "You're a monster," she screamed at my back, her voice cracking with fury and despair as I walked past her toward the front porch. "You're a cruel, vindictive, heartless little monster." I stopped on the top step of the porch, the very porch my father had built with his own 2 hands, and looked back down at her over my shoulder one last time. "I'm not a monster, Evelyn," I said calmly, feeling the morning sun hit my face. "I'm just the adult you forced me to become. Now get off my lawn before I have you arrested for trespassing." I turned the heavy brass knob and walked into the house. The heavy oak front door clicked solidly shut behind me, completely blocking out the pathetic sound of her screaming. The interior of the house was an absolute, horrifying disaster. It smelled intensely of stale red wine, cheap, overpowering perfume, and deep neglect. The beautiful, hand-laid oak floors were deeply scratched at and scuffed. The walls were dirty and stained, and there was rotting trash piled up on the kitchen counters. The modern glass furniture she had bought was chipped and dusty. But as I walked through the rooms, looking underneath the superficial damage and the filth, I could see that the bones of the house, my father's incredibly strong, perfectly measured bones, were still perfectly intact. I walked slowly from room to room, running my hand along the custom woodwork, tracing the joints he had sanded, and feeling a profound, overwhelming, healing sense of peace wash over my entire soul. The toxic ghost of Evelyn was already fading into nothingness, and the warm, protective, loving presence of my father was slowly returning to the halls. I spent the next 6 months completely gutting and meticulously renovating the house. I hired crews to tear out every single piece of modern, cold, sterile garbage Evelyn had installed. I stripped the oak floors back to their natural, beautiful grain and restained them the exact color my dad had chosen. I sourced and restored the original 1920s craftsman fixtures. I turned the massive basement back into a highly functional, state-of-the-art woodshop, outfitting it with the absolute best tools money could buy. I didn't do it to flip the house. I didn't do it to sell it for a profit. I did it because it was my home, and I was finally taking it back to honor him. I never saw or heard from Evelyn ever again. I heard through a distant, mutual acquaintance a year later that she eventually had to move 2 states away to live in a cramped, incredibly run-down trailer park with a distant, estranged sister who absolutely despised her. She has absolutely nothing left of the wealth she stole. She has no friends, no status, and no future. She is entirely, completely forgotten. Today, when I sit on my beautifully restored, wide wraparound porch, drinking dark roast coffee in the early morning just like my dad used to, I don't feel anger anymore. I don't feel the burning need for vengeance that kept me alive in my car all those years ago. The anger burned out a long, long time ago, completely consumed by the massive, undeniable success of the beautiful life I built for myself. I learned the absolute hardest possible way that true security doesn't come from a house, an inheritance, or a bank account balance. It comes from the deep, unshakable knowledge that you can survive the absolute worst things people can do to you, and you can rise from the ashes stronger, sharper, and absolutely unstoppable. Evelyn thought she was destroying me the night she handed me those black trash bags and locked the door. In reality, she was just handing me the heavy bricks I would eventually use to build my empire, and for that, in a strange, twisted, beautiful way, I am almost grateful.